The sizzling sound of duck fat hitting the pan was my lullaby, my solace, my peace in a world that was anything but peaceful. In 2005, I was an ambitious young chef, a culinary mercenary hustling for a name, bouncing between high-profile catering gigs and exclusive private events. My skills with a knife were as sharp as my ambition, and my specialty was navigating kitchens where chaos reigned. But nothing prepared me for the chaos of Sean Diddy Combs' parties. Before we start, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more updates. At the time, Diddy was the epitome of excess. The man threw parties that could rival ancient Roman feasts, events so decadent and over the top they felt unreal, like stepping into a fever dream. As one of the chefs hired to cater these events, I wasn't just there to cook. I was there to witness, to endure, and sometimes to survive. The nightmares I saw in those sprawling mansions and rented penthouses still haunt me today. It wasn't unusual for a party's theme to change an hour before guests arrived. One moment, it would be old Hollywood glamour, and the next, it was underwater Atlantis fantasy. My team and I would scramble, hauling out oysters and caviar to replace the sliders and mini tacos we'd prepped. Diddy wants champagne and ice sculptures, the event planner would bark. Or Diddy says the sushi chef needs to dress as Poseidon. That was my first lesson. Reality bent to Diddy's whims. If he wanted it, it happened, and fast. The guest list was a veritable who's who of the entertainment industry. A-listers rubbed elbows with athletes, models, and people who simply exuded wealth and mystique. But despite the glamour, the backstage of these events was something else entirely. I'd see waitstaff sobbing into bathroom sinks after being berated for using the wrong napkin fold. DJs would get death stares if the music dipped for even half a second. And in the kitchen, it was a battlefield. One night, I was tasked with preparing an array of hors d'oeuvres for a guest count that ballooned from 200 to 600 in a matter of hours. I had to produce foie gras sliders, truffle arancini, and lobster ceviche at lightning speed. The air in the kitchen was thick with sweat and the smell of caramelizing onions. I remember cutting my hand on a mandolin slicer, blood dripping onto the cutting board. "No time for first aid," the head caterer snapped. I wrapped my hand in a dish towel and kept working. The show had to go on. Then there was the time Diddy decided, mid-party, that all the food stations needed live elements. He wanted flames, steam, smoke, the works. We were ordered to add flambés and tableside cooking setups to an already packed kitchen. I can still hear the scream of one sous chef who accidentally singed his eyebrows while igniting a pan of bananas Foster. We were working with barely any ventilation, the heat suffocating. The fire alarm went off twice that night, and both times Diddy waved it off like it was a fly in his champagne. The guests were something else too. A famous actress, whose name I won't mention, demanded her filet mignon be Michelin star rare. When I delivered it to her table, she took one bite, spat it into a linen napkin, and declared it was like chewing on a boot heel. Later, a rap mogul with a platinum grill stormed into the kitchen, yelling that his oysters Rockefeller were cold. He hurled a plate across the room, shattering it against the wall. No one flinched. We were used to it, but the real nightmares weren't always about the food or the guests. They were about the moments that stripped away any illusion of humanity. I'll never forget one party where the theme was white and gold elegance. The mansion was draped in silk and glittering lights, with a gold-dusted dessert bar that stretched the length of a basketball court. I was in the back, assembling croquembouches, when a commotion broke out near the pool. Someone, a young model, barely out of her teens, had fainted. The heat, the alcohol, the pressure, it was too much. Guests stepped over her like she was a spilled drink, too concerned with their selfies to offer help. It wasn't until the paramedics arrived that anyone seemed to care. And yet, Diddy's parties weren't always bleak. There were moments of surreal beauty, like the time he hired a string quartet to play hip-hop covers by the infinity pool, or when he handed out Cartier watches as party favors. These moments felt otherworldly, a glimpse into a life so far removed from reality it was almost intoxicating. But even these dazzling highs came with a dark edge, a sense that everything was teetering on the brink of collapse. One of the most harrowing nights was the New Year's Eve bash of 2005. The guest count was 1,200 and the menu included everything from Wagyu beef carpaccio to hand-rolled sushi made by a team flown in from Tokyo. The pressure was relentless. Halfway through the night, a power outage plunged the kitchen into darkness. We scrambled to light candles and use flashlights from our phones to keep the food coming. Meanwhile, the party raged on, oblivious. When the lights came back, the guests roared in approval as if it had been part of the spectacle. But in the kitchen, one of my colleagues collapsed from exhaustion. He was carried out, unnoticed. After the party ended, as the guests spilled into limos and the mansion quieted, we'd begin the Herculean task of cleaning up. The aftermath of a Diddy party was like the wreckage after a hurricane. Broken champagne flutes littered the floor, trampled hors d'oeuvres were ground into carpets, and the air was heavy with the smell of spilled alcohol and melted candle wax. I'd scrub pans until my fingers were raw, my body aching from 18 hours on my feet. In the years since, I've catered for royalty, billionaires, and Hollywood elites, but nothing compares to the carnage of those 2005 Diddy parties. They were a masterclass in excess, a test of endurance, and a glimpse into a world where the line between opulence and madness blurred. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, the phantom sound of fire alarms and Diddy's laugh echoing in my ears. But then I remember, I survived, and in the strange, chaotic way of the culinary world, those nights made me the chef I am today. I thought I had seen it all before 2005. Michelin star kitchens, the grueling boot camps of fine dining, the blistering pace of catering to celebrities. Yet none of that prepared me for the madness that were Diddy's parties. Each event felt like a trial by fire, an ever-escalating contest of excess, grandeur, and occasionally sheer absurdity. It wasn't just the scale of these parties that set them apart, but the unpredictability. You never knew what you were walking into, and by the end of the night, you always left with the feeling that reality had warped around you. These events were like fever dreams, their details seared into my memory as vivid snapshots of glamour and chaos. There was one summer night in 2005 when I was called to cater a party at a sprawling Hamptons estate. The theme was heaven and hell, and Diddy's vision was as extreme as you'd imagine. One half of the venue was transformed into an ethereal paradise. Clouds of dry ice wafted around fountains filled with rose, and cherubic models roamed the grounds in glittering silver robes, offering guests delicate canapes of scalloped crudo and edible flowers. The other half was the underworld, dimly lit, pulsing with crimson light, and staffed by servers wearing horns and leather. Here the menu was indulgent. Roasted suckling pigs, trays of spiced lamb skewers dripping with harissa, and molten chocolate desserts that oozed red chili ganache. At first glance, the juxtaposition was breathtaking, a visual masterpiece. But beneath the surface, it was a logistical nightmare. The kitchen staff was stationed in the hell section, and the heat from the stoves and ovens blended with the ambient temperature to create an inferno. We sweated through our uniforms as we churned out platter after platter of food, hoping our presentation matched the ethereal quality of the heavens side of the party. The irony of working in hell wasn't lost on us. It was during this event that I witnessed a moment so surreal it still feels like a hallucination. Around midnight, someone decided the party needed a spectacle. Diddy, in his infinite wisdom, ordered a champagne tower constructed at the center of the pool. The tower, 10 feet tall and precariously balanced, was a feat of engineering, assembled by a team of frantic caterers under the watchful eye of a stern event planner who looked ready to faint. We held our breath as it was completed, and just as the last bottle was placed on top, a drunken guest decided to dive into the pool. His splash knocked the entire structure into the water. Champagne, glass shards, and panic spread in every direction. Diddy, however, merely laughed, toasting the chaos with the one intact bottle retrieved from the wreckage. If there was one constant at these parties, it was the sheer volume of requests that defied logic or practicality. On one occasion, I was told to prepare 50 vegan dishes on the fly, an odd request considering the menu had already been vetted and finalized as meat-heavy. Diddy had decided, apparently after an impromptu conversation with a Hollywood producer, that the party needed to cater more to the wellness crowd. The result? A chaotic scramble to fashion something remotely elegant out of the kitchen's limited plant-based ingredients. I remember making a quinoa and beet tartare that night, plated hastily with avocado cream and pickled radish. It looked like something from a 90s vegetarian cookbook, but the guests loved it, or perhaps they were too polite to say otherwise. Not all the chaos stemmed from the kitchen. Sometimes it was the guests who added to the absurdity. I'll never forget the night a famous pop star, notorious for her erratic behavior, locked herself in the wine cellar. She had wandered off during the party and somehow found her way to the private collection, where she decided to sample bottles that cost more than my monthly rent. It took an hour to coax her out, and by then, she had drunk nearly $10,000 worth of wine. The event staff tried to smooth it over, but the incident became one of the night's infamous anecdotes. Then there was the rapper who, mid-party, demanded we prepare a plate of fried chicken. This wasn't on the menu, nor did we have the ingredients. But when a guest of that stature makes a request, you find a way. One of my sous chefs sprinted down the block to a nearby fast food joint, returning with a bucket of chicken, which we hastily rebranded with garnishes and sauces to make it look gourmet. The guest never knew the difference and left singing our praises. One of the most bizarre events I catered that year was a masquerade party in Beverly Hills. The entire venue was shrouded in mystery, with guests required to wear elaborate masks and adhere to a strict no-phones policy. It felt like stepping into a Kubrick film. The kitchen was hidden in a separate wing of the mansion, and all communication with the event staff happened through intermediaries who darted back and forth with last-minute requests. At one point, I was handed a tray of black truffle risotto to serve directly to Diddy. Nervous as hell, I carried the tray into the main room where chandeliers sparkled like stars and masked guests lounged on velvet sofas. Diddy took one bite, nodded in approval, and asked for the recipe. I don't think I've ever exhaled more relief in my life. Despite the absurdity, these events weren't without their moments of humanity. There were times when the kitchen staff bonded over shared exhaustion, trading jokes and stories as we worked into the early hours. I remember one sous chef, a wiry, tattooed guy with a penchant for heavy metal, who could whip up the most delicate pastries with surgical precision. He'd blast Metallica in the prep room to keep the energy up, earning groans from the event planners but smiles from the rest of us. And then there was the night I caught a glimpse of the man behind the persona. It was after another extravagant party, this time at a penthouse in Manhattan. The guests had left, the music had died down, and the staff was busy cleaning up. I was taking a breather on the balcony, gazing at the glittering skyline, when Diddy appeared. He leaned on the railing beside me, looking uncharacteristically subdued. "Long night?" he asked. I nodded, unsure of what to say. For a moment we stood in silence, two people from entirely different worlds sharing the same view. He sighed, muttered something about always chasing the next big thing, and then walked away. It was a fleeting moment, but it stuck with me. A reminder that even the architects of excess have their quiet doubts. As 2005 came to a close, my tenure as a Diddy party chef ended, and I moved on to other projects. But those nights left a mark on me, shaping the way I approached my craft and the industry as a whole. They taught me resilience, adaptability, and the art of keeping a cool head in the face of absolute chaos. More than that, they gave me stories, wild, unbelievable tales that I still recount to this day, usually over a drink or two. When I think back to those parties, I don't just remember the madness and the stress. I remember the sheer, unapologetic audacity of it all. Love him or hate him, Diddy knew how to throw a party. And for better or worse, I'll always be grateful to have been a part of that wild, glittering circus, even if it sometimes felt more like a nightmare than a dream. It's easy to reduce the memory of those parties to mere anecdotes, strange, chaotic snapshots of a world most people only glimpse through screens. But the truth is, the experience of cooking for Diddy's events in 2005 was something deeper, something that challenged not just my skills as a chef, but my entire understanding of what it meant to work under pressure, to perform for an audience I'd never meet, and to adapt in ways I didn't think possible. One thing that's difficult to convey about those nights is the sheer pace. It wasn't just fast. It was relentless, like running a marathon where every step had to be perfect, and the finish line kept moving further away. In the world of fine dining, precision is everything. You plan meticulously, executing every step with a surgeon's focus. But at Diddy's parties, precision had to coexist with chaos. There was no room for error, yet the environment was designed to produce errors. I remember vividly one night in Miami when a thunderstorm rolled in halfway through an outdoor event. The setting had been idyllic, an open-air patio overlooking the ocean with fairy lights strung between palm trees and a live jazz band providing the soundtrack. The menu was light and tropical. mango ceviche, jerk chicken skewers, plantain chips with avocado mousse, and a centerpiece whole roast pig. But when the skies opened up, it was like a dam had burst, not just with rain, but with panic. Guests scrambled for cover as the rain soaked everything. Tables were overturned, plates abandoned mid-bite, and the band fled, instruments in hand. The kitchen, which had been set up under a temporary canopy, was suddenly exposed to the elements. Steam hissed off hot pans as water poured in, and staff scrambled to salvage what they could. In the chaos, someone dropped a tray of freshly seared scallops, the delicate rounds tumbling into the mud. It felt like a disaster. But then, in the middle of it all, Diddy appeared. Drenched but unfazed, he shouted for the music to resume. Within minutes, the party was moved indoors. The band was playing again, and he was encouraging guests to keep the energy alive. Somehow, we pulled it together. The roast pig, miraculously unscathed, became the centerpiece of an impromptu buffet, and we turned the soaked ceviche into something resembling a tropical gazpacho. By the end of the night, the guests were dancing barefoot, wet hair plastered to their faces, laughing like it was the best party they'd ever attended. That night taught me something crucial. Even in disaster, presentation and confidence matter as much as execution. The guests didn't care about the scallops in the mud or the rain in their cocktails. What they remembered was the atmosphere, the sense that they were part of something extraordinary. It's a lesson I've carried into every event I've worked since. But not every moment of those parties was exhilarating. Some were downright eerie. One particular night stands out. A Halloween event in a sprawling Beverly Hills mansion that felt more like a Gothic castle. The theme was Nightmare Realms, and the decor was unsettling in its detail. Cobwebbed chandeliers, blood-red lighting, and performers dressed as ghouls and specters who moved silently through the crowd. The menu, too, was crafted to unnerve. Squid ink pasta that looked like writhing tentacles, black garlic ice cream served in miniature coffins, and foie gras terrines shaped like human hearts. The kitchen was located in the mansion's basement, a cavernous space that felt like it had been plucked from a horror film. Dimly lit and lined with stone walls, it was a far cry from the sleek, modern setups I was used to. As the night wore on, the atmosphere began to get to us. The performers, staying in character, would occasionally drift into the kitchen, their hollow stares unsettling even the most seasoned among us. At one point, a chef screamed when he turned to find a pale, skeletal figure standing silently behind him. It turned out to be one of the performers, but the moment left us all on edge. What made that night even more surreal was the behavior of the guests. Maybe it was the theme, or maybe it was the endless flow of absinthe cocktails, but something about the evening brought out a strange energy. People disappeared into hidden corridors, whispers spread of a secret ritual happening in one of the upper rooms, and at one point, a woman in a Victorian gown fainted dramatically in the middle of the ballroom. Whether it was part of the act or not, I never found out. Despite the strange energy, the night was a success, at least by Diddy standards. The guests raved about the food, particularly the black garlic ice cream, which they described as deliciously disturbing. But as we packed up the kitchen in the early hours of the morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been part of something more than just a party. It was as if we'd stepped into another world, one where the line between performance and reality had blurred. Not all of the events I worked that year were as extravagant. There were smaller, more intimate gatherings, though even these had their own unique challenges. I recall one dinner party hosted in Diddy's penthouse suite, where the guest list was limited to about 20 people. The setting was elegant but understated, with soft jazz playing in the background and candles casting a warm glow. The menu was simple yet refined. Seared scallops with a saffron beurre blanc, duck confit with parsnip puree, and a chocolate soufflé for dessert. What made this night memorable wasn't the food or the setting, but the sheer intensity of the scrutiny. Unlike the large parties where food was often an accessory to the spectacle, this dinner placed it front and center. Every bite was analyzed, every dish dissected. One guest, a renowned food critic, asked detailed questions about the provenance of the saffron and the method used to crisp the duck skin. It was nerve-wracking but also oddly exhilarating, a reminder of why I became a chef in the first place. The most surreal moment of that night came when Diddy himself stepped into the kitchen. He was surprisingly calm. his usual larger-than-life persona dialed down to something almost human. He complimented the scallops, asked about the beurre blanc, and even joked about his failed attempt to cook a soufflé years earlier. For a brief moment, he wasn't a mogul or an icon, just a man who appreciated good food. Of course, moments like these were rare. Most nights were a blur of stress and sweat, punctuated by the occasional triumph or disaster. There was the time a caviar station collapsed under the weight of too many ice sculptures, sending $10,000 worth of beluga tumbling to the floor. Or the night I had to make an emergency run to a bakery at midnight because someone decided the party needed eclairs, hundreds of them. And then there were the quieter moments, the ones that often get overshadowed by the chaos. Like the time I shared a cigarette with a fellow chef in the alley behind a venue, both of us too exhausted to speak. Or the way the kitchen staff would rally around each other during the most hectic moments, passing water bottles and words of encouragement as we pushed through the night. By the time I walked away from catering Diddy's events in late 2005, I had a strange sense of both relief and longing. The parties were over for me, at least as far as I was concerned, but their echoes lingered in my mind. I began to notice how those nights had seeped into my subconscious, weaving themselves into my approach to cooking, managing, and even living. It wasn't just the culinary challenges or the demands of high-profile service, it was the culture, the energy, the complete immersion in a world of extremes. To this day, there's no easy way to describe what those nights taught me, or what they took from me. One of the lingering effects was the way I now interpreted chaos. In a kitchen, chaos can be a dangerous thing. Burnt sauces, dropped trays, tempers flaring. But it's also inevitable. Before Diddy's events, I treated chaos as something to control or suppress. Afterward, I understood it as something to channel. There's a kind of rhythm to pandemonium, an ebb and flow that you have to feel in your bones to navigate. At those parties, there was never any chance to stop the wave from crashing, but you could learn to ride it, even as it threatened to pull you under. This became part of who I was as a chef, my identity shaped by those nights of improvisation and endurance. The environments I worked in after 2005 rarely had the same high stakes, but they often brought their own flavors of intensity. For a long time, I found myself reflexively comparing everything to those parties, a sort of culinary PTSD that made ordinary challenges feel laughable in comparison. Burnt bread during a busy dinner service? No problem. I'd once dealt with an entire dessert station melting into ruin because a party planner forgot to request refrigeration. Complaints from a demanding diner? A breeze compared to being yelled at by a platinum-selling rapper because the oysters weren't icy enough. Those events, insane as they were, had hardened me in ways I hadn't even realized at the time. Yet the lessons went beyond culinary resilience. There was something almost philosophical about working at the intersection of such extremes. Extreme wealth, extreme indulgence, extreme pressure. I saw firsthand how people behaved when given everything they could ever want, or when their desires outpaced what was feasible. The result was a microcosm of human nature under the influence of unlimited resources and unchecked ego. I learned that money doesn't just change what's possible, it changes what's expected. The wealthiest guests at Diddy's parties often had the most absurd requests, not out of necessity, but out of sheer curiosity to see whether their whims could be met. One incident, years after my Diddy-era experiences, brought this lesson back into sharp focus. I was working a gala for an international luxury brand, catering for a crowd of celebrities, influencers, and high society elites. A famous fashion designer sent a message to the kitchen requesting his dish be gold-plated. At first, I thought he meant figuratively, but no, he genuinely wanted edible gold leaf layered over his entree. The staff scrambled to accommodate, covering his Wagyu steak in shimmering sheets of gold that made the dish look more like a trophy than a meal. He barely touched it, of course. The request wasn't about consumption. It was about possibility, a performance of power through food. I saw this dynamic over and over again, but nowhere was it more exaggerated than at Diddy's events. Food became more than sustenance or art. It was status, a way to assert dominance over the moment. This could be maddening as a chef, especially when guests would take a single bite of a dish that had taken hours to prepare, then discard it without a second thought. At first, it felt like an insult, a waste of effort and creativity, but over time, I began to see it differently. These parties weren't about savoring, they were about spectacle. The food wasn't the end goal. It was part of a larger tapestry of excess, woven into the atmosphere as much as the music, the lighting, and the designer outfits. Understanding this changed how I approached my work. It wasn't about personal pride or even traditional notions of culinary excellence. It was about delivering an experience. Another thing that stayed with me from those nights was the sheer unpredictability of people. No two parties were alike because no two crowds were alike. I learned to read a room with the precision of a poker player watching for tells. A lull in conversation might signal the need for past appetizers to re-energize the mood. A sudden surge toward the bar could mean guests were bored with their entrees. These subtle dynamics taught me how to anticipate needs before they were voiced, a skill that became invaluable in later roles, whether I was running a restaurant or managing a catering team. Then there were the quieter, stranger moments that resurfaced in my mind at odd times, like dreams that refused to fade. I'll never forget a conversation I overheard one night while restocking the dessert table. Two guests, both famous enough to be instantly recognizable, were discussing the concept of perfection. One argued that perfection was a myth, an unattainable standard designed to make people feel inadequate. The other countered that perfection was real but fleeting, like a single moment of clarity in an otherwise chaotic life. They debated this for nearly half an hour, their voices low and thoughtful amid the din of the party. It struck me that even in the heart of indulgence and extravagance, people still grappled with the same existential questions as anyone else. Ironically, the most grounded people at these events were often the staff. We were the ones who saw behind the curtain, who knew that the gilded opulence was propped up by frantic effort and duct-taped improvisation. There was a kind of camaraderie that developed among the workers, a shared understanding that we were the invisible gears making the machine run. I grew close to several of the servers and bartenders during those months, bonding over stolen moments of laughter and shared exhaustion. In many ways, we became a temporary family, united by the chaos we faced together. Years later, I ran into one of the bartenders from those parties at a food festival in Los Angeles. He was running his own craft cocktail business by then, a far cry from the vodka and champagne setups we'd worked back in 2005. We reminisced about those nights, laughing at the absurdities and marveling at how far we'd come. "You know," he said, "those were some of the hardest gigs I ever worked, but I think they taught me more than any bartending school ever could." I knew exactly what he meant. For all the madness, those events did something else for me. They expanded my sense of possibility. As much as I scoffed at the extravagance at the time, I couldn't deny the creative spark it ignited in me. The challenge of crafting menus that pushed boundaries, the pressure to execute flawlessly in impossible circumstances, the sheer scale of the vision, these were experiences that forced me to think bigger, to dream beyond the confines of a traditional kitchen. I began to see food as more than just something to be cooked and served. It was an art form, a performance, a language that could convey emotion and tell stories. Even now, when I create a new dish or plan an event, I find myself channeling the spirit of those parties, not the excess or the ego, but the ambition. The desire to create something unforgettable, something that lingers in the mind long after the last bite. It's a legacy I never expected to carry, but one I'm oddly grateful for. There's one last memory I'll share, though it's one of the quietest. It was after a particularly wild party, one that had stretched into the early hours of the morning. The kitchen was silent, the chaos finally subsided, and I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The city was still alive, lights flickering in the distance. But in that moment, I felt a rare sense of peace. I thought about the night, the triumphs, the disasters, the surreal moments that would eventually become stories. And for the first time I realized something. As much as those nights had tested me, they had also shaped me. Not just as a chef, but as a person. The parties are long behind me now, but their lessons remain. I've carried them into every kitchen, every menu, every interaction with a guest. They remind me that cooking is more than just a job or a craft. It's a way of engaging with the world, of creating connections, of leaving a mark. And for that, I'll always be grateful for the madness of those unforgettable nights. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? What are your thoughts on the chef's revelations about Diddy's 2005 parties? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.